Did you know that there are 9 different food preservation methods? I'm happy to share that Melissa K. Norris is on the podcast today discussing the 9 different food preservation methods. If you are new to the homesteading space, you may not have heard her name, but you will. From now on, you'll probably see her everywhere. She's really well known in the community, and I'm excited for this episode for you to hear this. She shares some of her story in the beginning. I did split this interview up into 2 parts, so next episode will be the second part of this series. Let's get started and listen to what Melissa has to say. But first, I have an exciting announcement. Hey there, homestead dreamer. Whether you're just starting out or have already dipped your toes into the homesteading world, I've got something special for you. It's all about setting up a solid foundation for your homestead plan and income strategy through thoughtful action and implementation. Because let's face it, starting a homestead is not too difficult, but keeping it sustainable can be a real challenge. Now, the decisions you make in those early years can truly make or break your experience. You either end up feeling confident and content, or you find yourself caught up in a never-ending struggle, like on a hamster wheel. And we definitely want to avoid that. That's exactly why I've created an amazing resource for you, the workshop for beginner homesteaders and dreamers. With this tool, you'll have a rock-solid foundation to build your homesteading dream upon. In the pre-recorded workshop, you'll dive into some valuable topics such as strategies for planning, savings, and generating an income, how to find and become a part of a supportive homesteading community, and developing the right mindset for homesteading success. And here's the cherry on top. Throughout the month of June, I'm offering my workshop for beginner homesteaders and dreamers at a special discount price. It's an hour and 40-minute video where I personally guide you through most of the Homesteading for Beginners workbook, which is included in the workshop price, by the way. To grab this offer, head over to healthyhomesteading.com/workshop and use the code podcast at checkout. With this code, you'll get over 20% off the already low regular price. But remember, this discount is only available during the month of June, so make sure you take action soon. You can find all necessary links in the show notes of this podcast episode as well. I'm eager for you to get started. Let's make your homesteading dreams come true together. So today we have a very special guest. If you've been in the homesteading space for any amount of time, you've likely heard her name. She's an influential person in the homesteading community. She's an author, a speaker, a blogger, a podcaster, and a person that desires to see homesteaders succeed, which is why the main reason I have her on this podcast for beginners, the Homesteading for Beginners podcast, because I can see through her the information she shares, through her heart. She wants to see people healthier and more confident in their homesteading skills. So welcome, Melissa. I am so thrilled that you are here.
Thanks, Mona. I'm excited to be here.
So I have a funny story to share about us meeting the first time. So this back in April of 2021, when the audio social app Clubhouse was really a big thing, was booming. You appeared in one of the Clubhouse rooms to listen in. So you just nonchalantly was in there. One of the other people in the room spotted you first and went all fangirl. She was all getting excited to see you there. And then they were like, "It's Melissa K. Norris." And I was like, "Who is that?" So that's the funny part. But let me tell you.
I love it.
I had no idea who you were. Okay. But at this point, I was very much out of the online homesteading loop. I had been away from blogging and social media for a while at this point. So I missed it. I missed your boom, but then I did a research and I searched you and learned more about you. And I understood why everybody was fangirling about you. And you were just so kind to come and have a conversation with us. And then you even came back and had an interview with us on Clubhouse. So I just thank you for that. And that's how we met. That I wanted to help people understand how that happened. Do you remember that whole
I I do. It was funny. In that moment of time, Clubhouse was this very big thing, very short lived,
Mhm.
as some trends do, And I totally remember, and I was excited just to see the conversations that were happening, which is why I was coming in like as a fly on
Mhm.
a wall. And if I ever get so big headed that I expect people to know who I am, the good Lord, I'm sure will knock me down a peg or two. So don't feel bad that you didn't know who I was.
Good.
There's a reason that you should. Um, but what I loved is at that time where we were at in the pandemic, there were still more people at home than before. And it really made homesteading and what that movement is in our modern context in this moment in time, even though we're a couple years, past then, it really was bringing that desire to people who had maybe wanted to move that route for a long time, but they hadn't had that catalytic moment where they said, I'm going to do this. But that's kind of what the pandemic brought. So for folks who
Mhm.
were already, it was on their radar and they were interested in it. It was kind of that push they needed to start. But it also was a really beautiful thing because even though it was lots of bad things came from that, right? There was a lot of good that came from it too. And so a lot of people who maybe didn't really realize that you could do a modern form of homesteading. It's not really full on farming. There are parts
Mhm.
of homesteading that are farming and there are homesteaders that do farming, but it's really that backyard at home environment where you're looking to produce more than you consume or looking to
Mhm.
make more in your own kitchen or on your backyard, and all different things, not just food. It's for some people it's making homemade soap, it's making homemade skincare items. So homesteading encompasses so much more than just the food growth and production, though that is a large part of it and where a lot of people start. So it was really exciting to see so many people looking at that as even a possibility that it hadn't been on their radar at all before. And so Clubhouse, I feel in that moment of time was really helping that and just creating discussion for people to talk
Mhm.
about it and start to realize, what possibilities and what things they actually could do and what other people were doing, and brought some hope in
Mhm.
at a time where I think a lot of people needed hope.
Right, I agree, and for me, it brought community that I didn't have because we moved from California to Georgia, we had been here a couple years, but I was newly at my homestead trying to restart my life here with my family, and I had nobody that really wanted to talk about homesteading. So that was for me, it was like, "Oh, I found my people," and it was just such a great thing. And I made so many connections. I'm actually having several people that I've met on Clubhouse on my podcast and have had them. So many good friendships came from that. So, yeah, I agree. So many people realize that it wasn't as scary to get into the lifestyle as they thought just by listening to those conversations.
Yeah.
Okay, so first start by helping my listeners get to know you. Um, so I know you're a generational homesteader, but did you always embrace this lifestyle? I mean, I would love to hear more about your story.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm a fifth generational homesteader, but what's really funny is, prior to, maybe like 12, 15 years ago, we were just country people. We just
Mhm.
came and really we raised a good portion of our own food because we didn't have the money to buy it at the store. And my dad is, I always feel I have to preface this part. Otherwise, people are
Mhm.
like, this doesn't make sense to me. It's one of
Mhm.
my most asked questions. My dad was born during the Great Depression. And so he was a child during the Great Depression. But when the Great Depression ended, it didn't really change their lifestyle because they didn't have, for a lot of seasons and a lot of different times, they didn't have money to buy outside food. So the only thing they would buy from the store would be a little bit of sugar and a little bit of flour and salt. And there were seasons where anything else they ate came from what they were producing themselves. And that didn't change when the Great Depression ended. So you're probably doing the math and wondering how that works. My mom is 20 years younger than my dad, and she was his second marriage. So I have some older half siblings. And so I was born much later in his life, and I am now 42.
Mhm.
So I feel like I have to say that, or people are like, wait a minute, back it up. How was your dad raised during the Great Depression?
Yeah.
So raising your own food was always something that he practiced and did. And when I was growing up, I really didn't realize that a lot of that was still necessity because we were actually poor. My mom sewed my clothes when I was little, which I have to tell you, I did not appreciate when I was little. I wanted store-bought clothes just like everybody else when I was going to school, and those types of things. But back then, as I said, I'm 42, then it was cheaper to sew your clothes than it is now. Fabric prices and zippers and buttons and all those things now. And we've got cheaper clothing options with big stores. Like when I was growing up, there were no Walmarts around. I still remember when Kmart came in, and that was kind of a big deal. So there wasn't really cheaper clothing options when I was little either. So all of that to say, it was just really a way of life, but we just looked at it as what a lot of country people did. They had a garden and would can and cook from scratch, and there weren't any back then, of course, no delivery options for food services and even delivery at all. In fact, I still live on the same road where I grew up, and the closest McDonald's is still about a 45-minute drive away from us. So
Mm.
the option of fast food wasn't really even here unless you wanted to drive an hour almost one way and then back.
Mm.
And most people weren't willing to do that for just to get drive-through food. So I was very much just raised this way, and it wasn't until I got into high school that I realized when I would go and stay the night at other people's homes that they didn't have mason jars with food, and they didn't have cows, and they weren't pulling their own beef from the freezer, and they had Oreo cookies. I still remember I was a freshman in high school, and I was going to a girlfriend's house to stay the night, and she was all excited. She's like, "We get Oreo cookies tonight." And I'm like, "Great, what are they?" I'd never had them before. And I still don't get what all the fuss is about, I'll be honest. I'm like, I much prefer homemade chocolate chip cookies to an Oreo because that my mom baked cookies. We didn't have store-bought, but she would make cookies. So, of course, as I became an adult and I got married at 18, my husband and I are getting ready to celebrate 24 years of marriage. I also started working full-time as a pharmacy tech. And so I wasn't home. I was working full-time, and I used convenience foods because those pre-packed mixes and boxes and casseroles in a box and all those different things, they were convenient and they were easier. And so I started relying on a lot of that and not relying so much on making everything from scratch like my mom had. We still did a garden and still canned because I have never liked store-bought green beans. My kids won't eat them. We try to be polite for at other people's homes and they serve that, but we don't like store-bought green beans or green beans in restaurants. Homegrown, completely different flavor profile. They actually have flavor. So it was when I have two children, and when my daughter was an infant, the heartburn I got from when I was pregnant with both my kids didn't subside with her after having her like it did with my son. And it got to the point where I was taking prescription medications up to 6 times a day, but
Wow.
it wasn't controlling the symptoms. So I had stomach ulcers and just really bad GERD. I basically got to the point where I really couldn't eat anything. I was very, very thin. And I went into the specialist and they said, well, we need to do a scope because, your age, your weight, like all the normal indicators that people have GERD, you don't fall into those categories. So we need to see what's going on internally. So went in and had an endoscope done. And when they were doing the endoscope, they ended up biopsying my upper stomach and a spot on my esophagus that had a lot of erosion. And just kind of looked suspicious. So they suspected cancer. Thankfully, it wasn't. It came back benign on both the biopsy spots, but I had cellular change, and cellular change is that precursor to it actually turning to precancerous, and then cancerous. So the specialist said, look, you have to get off all of these prescription medications. You should have never been allowed to have been on them at these doses for the amount of time that you have been. And you have to figure out how to control this by the foods that you eat, or the next time you come in here, you will probably have a diagnosis of cancer. So I was 29, I had a husband, 2 babies at home. And I mean, it was it was kind of a shock. I mean, I'm so grateful that the diagnosis was not cancerous, but I was like, okay. So I was driving home because we live so far out. It was an hour drive home, and I have this huge stack of papers on the car seat behind me. And it was just this very defining moment that I knew that God was giving me an opportunity to figure it out, or it would lead it to cancer and most likely death.
Mm.
And so I came home and I started just deep diving research, just keyboard warrior, just
Mm.
looking up everything I could find on foods that triggered ulcers and what's actually in our food and what's in all the ingredients, which led me down the rabbit hole of really beginning to understand genetically modified foods and the different fats and the different oils and just all the different things and additives that are put into our foods and how those can affect the body. And so I did I pulled everything out of the cupboards and got rid of anything that was a highly genetically modified crop. I had food dye in it, had high fructose corn syrup in it. I mean, all the stuff, and started cooking with grass-fed butter, coconut oil, lard. And at that point, we were raising our own grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And only the reason for that is because I grew up raising our cattle that way because we couldn't afford to buy grain. So thankfully, we couldn't afford to buy grain and we couldn't afford to buy weed killer. So by default, I grew up on grass-fed, grass-finished, better than organic beef,
Nice.
simply because we couldn't afford anything else. So thankfully, that was the process we were using to raise our beef already for our family. But to try to find at that point in time, because we're going back, oh gosh, almost 14 years ago now, there wasn't as much available on the market like there is now. There's actually a lot more available for us as consumers. We've kind of made our voice heard, even though we've got a lot further to go. And so in order to afford it or find it, we had to start raising it ourselves. And so we started raising our own pasture-raised pork, pigs, and meat chickens for our birds. And then, of course, hens for eggs. And then we really started increasing. Had always grown and canned a year's worth of green beans because I said I never could eat the store-bought. But the rest of the garden was really just for fresh eating and jam and jelly. Like I would can homemade jam and jelly. But that was pretty much it. So not a huge portion of our food year round were we producing ourselves. And so we really just went full board and started. Now it's about 99% of our meat we raise ourselves for our family of 4 throughout the whole year, and 65% of our vegetables for the entire year, and about 70% of our fruit. So that was my big push and the reason we got into it. But then I was within 6 months of completely changing my diet. Because you had to the doses and the medications I was on, you had to taper, or you could trigger a really almost like a storm in the body where you would produce massive amounts of acid and your proton pumps would go into hyperdrive. So I had to slowly wean off. And that was a 6-month process. But after that, I was completely healed. I didn't have any of the symptoms, was able to introduce a good portion of foods back in. In the beginning, it was very limited as I was going through healing. But I was also a pharmacy tech. So I worked in regular medicine. And prior to that, if anybody would have told me you could just heal yourself by the food that you're eating, I would not have believed them. I would have been like, they are full of it. But when I went through it myself, I was like, oh my gosh, like people just don't know this. They don't realize the power that is just in the food and the way it's raised. Because if they did, everybody would make these changes, or most people would make these changes. And it's simply a matter of the greater public just doesn't know. And so it really became a mission field, I have to say, of mine. I feel like a walking evangelist because I saw so many people as a pharmacy tech that were having a lot of, very life debilitating or just low quality of life. And I'm like, oh my goodness, if they just knew, they would be able to get off, not everybody and every medication, but so many people, if they only knew how much better and how different their life would be. And so it became like a burning passion to share it with people. And a lot of people are actually quite interested, even if they don't have the same health problems. I find a lot of people who are looking to this way of life have health problems, and sometimes that's their catalyst, like it was for me. But other times it's people who are coming to it because they just want to be healthier and more self-sufficient. They want to, do better for the land and the environment and all of those things.
Mhm.
And they, once they start, then they like, oh my goodness, like
Mm.
I don't have XYZ anymore. So it might not have started with health, but then when they realize what it's done for their health almost inadvertently, then they're like, oh wow. So anyways, that was a very
Right.
long-winded part of my story, but I get
No,
very
that's
excited.
good. Yeah, I love your story, and I remember hearing you share that in the clubhouse. Uh, but I did want you to know, like, I love that I mean, I don't love that you went through all of that to figure out where you wanted to be, where your mission basically. I wish you didn't have to go through that to figure it out, but it's just that is a lot of everyone's story. That was my story as well, and my health changes. I saw health changes because I got rid of certain things and added certain things. But I also wanted to share that your story is very similar to my husband's, in that his parents were also raised in the Great Depression. They were actually older, I think, than yours. My husband's older than you as well, but he always had to explain that too. It's like, okay, well, my mom was 42 when she had me,
Yeah.
so. But yeah, so that's great. But yeah, I love. I Like I said, I don't love that people have to go through bad hardships to discover what works for them, but thank God we do discover what works for us, because otherwise
Yeah. Well, otherwise it
anyway.
would just be for naught. I mean, because we're going to go
Yeah,
through hard, struggles regardless. But
right,
if there's nothing good that comes from it, then it's just a struggle. But if
right.
there's that good that comes from it, then it makes it worth it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And you can share your testimonies and things like that. Okay, so my listeners are new homesteaders and homestead dreamers. So many of the people listening um, don't have either just thinking about starting, um, or have started and just in the beginning stages. So, um, but a message I want, and I'm sure you do as well, people to know, is that your kitchen is a great place to start homesteading. You don't need land, you don't need all the animals. You can start in your kitchen, which brings us to the topic of preserving food. One of your books that you've written. How many books have you written so far?
That is, I have to actually sit and count for a minute.
Okay.
This one is my fifth. The fifth
Fifth
one
book.
is, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And the title is pres-
Everything Worth Preserving, the complete guide for food preservation at home.
okay. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And this is actually a part of a series I'm doing right now on the podcast about small scale homesteading. And I figured fits in perfectly with the topic of, you can start in your kitchen. Basically, you don't need all of the things. And it's a really good place to start because, like you said, like you shared, it can make so much difference in your health. I looked over your book and saw that there was 9 preserving methods that you share in
Yes.
there, and I didn't realize there was so many. There's probably more than that, right? Like, is that all of the preserving methods?
Yeah. Well, it's actually all of the preserving methods that you can use, because different
Right.
foods, safety wise, right?
Mm,
Some can't be preserved with one method, but they can with another. So it's really a guide that walks you through all of the different forms and then
okay.
tells you which foods can safely be done using that preservation method. So, real quick, I'll just run through them. So, you've got
Okay.
canning, and you've got within canning, you've got water bath canning, which is safe for acidic foods. And then you have pressure canning, which is what you need to do non acidic foods. So, vegetables that are not being pickled, meats, and combination recipes. And
Mhm.
then you've got dehydrating, you've got freezing. Of course, most people are familiar with the deep freezer and use that. So you've got that method. And then you have fermenting, which is another form of food preservation that has
Mhm.
wonderful gut health properties to it and is also really easy. So what I'll run through these 9,
Right.
and then kind of dive deeper into the ones where you don't have to really buy any special equipment or are really easy to do without a big upfront investment.
Mhm.
So fermentation is one of those. And
Mhm.
then you've got root cellaring, which you don't have to have a root cellar. Now, for some crops, you do need to have an environment like a root cellar because there's specific humidity and temperature requirements in order for it to store long term. But there's actually quite a few things that you can do. I don't have a root cellar. We don't even have a basement. I don't have an unheated garage. I literally just have my house. And there's many ways that you can use those root cellaring techniques, just even in your regular kitchen,
Mhm.
or if you have a room that you can kind of partition off and keep a little bit cooler. Then there's freeze drying, which of course requires a freeze dryer, which is probably the biggest investment of home food preservation equipment.
Mhm.
And then you've got infusion, which can be done. Sometimes it's with vinegar, sometimes it's with alcohol, but different ways of infusing a liquid with the herb. And then you've got salting and smoking. So salt curing and or smoking. And really the salting and the smoking are kind of forms of dehydrating because the action they're taking the moisture out and that's what is stopping the decay process
Mhm.
and the further breakdown of enzymes. But it's you're not putting it in most cases, you're not actually putting it in a dehydrator. You're using the salt independently. And with the smoking, obviously, you're going to need some type of smoker because it's the actual smoke itself that also
Right.
brings flavor. So those are really your nine. And I counted nine as water bath canning as one, and then pressure canning as the other, even though they're both technically canning, because you
Right.
are using different. You have to use a pressure canner, obviously, to pressure can, so slightly different mechanism there. But
Mhm.
those are your nine ways to preserve food at home. And aside from the pressure canner, and really even the water bath canner, because canning was really just invented with glass jars, the mason jars, in the latter part of the 1800s.
Mhm.
And then your pressure canners were introduced for pressure canning in the early 1900s. So as far
Mhm.
as humans eating food goes and preserving food, it's relatively new. And then of course
Mhm.
the freeze dryer was really home units just really came on the scene about 10-15 years ago. And then prior to that, I think it was about the 1940s or 50s that they started using freeze drying techniques. So
Okay.
those two are relatively newer, but the others are all just very old forms of home food preservation. It's just a lot of us haven't seen them modeled for us.
Mm.
Maybe your great grandparents or your grandparents did, depending on your age, maybe your mom and dad.
Mhm.
And so it's just been some skill sets that in the general public have been lost in just a few generations.
Right. And I feel like um, that, that happened to me. Like my grandparents were gardened, my grandfather gardened. My dad knew nothing about gardening. And then same with my mom. She didn't know anything about gardening, but her family, they were avocado farmers, and and she knew nothing. And so we're there's this whole group of people that are now trying to regain some of that knowledge by sharing it for the next generations to so I am familiar with a few of those. I mean, most of those I've done. I haven't done freeze drying. I actually have not done pressure canning yet. That's something that I've been homesteading for so long, but I just haven't
Oh,
done it.
Rhoda, I'm gonna get you doing it this summer now. I
Yeah,
feel
I
like
will.
I feel
I
like you
will.
just threw down the gauntlet, and I'm like,
Okay.
yes, let's do it.
Okay, yes, I will do it. It's just one of those things I meant to do and never did. I've done can water bath canning, steam canning. Fermenting is one of my favorites, and dehydrating is also one of my favorites. Root cellar, you'll have to talk more about that because I don't know. I mean, I've had like squash sitting in my house for the winter, but
Yeah,
is that considered root celling?
yeah, 100%. That is
Okay.
considered root cellaring. It's just not down in a root cellar per se.
Okay.
So the root cellaring technique, the easiest ones to do it with because you don't have to have as cool of temperatures or as high of humidity. And of course, this is going to change you may have higher humidity than I do because up here in the Pacific Northwest, we have some humidity, but it's not anything like Tennessee, or even
Mhm.
Virginia when I've been to those areas or Florida. They
Yeah.
have really high humidity, but they
Well,
also have
Georgia's. Yeah,
warmer
Georgia's
temp.
right
Yeah.
there.
Right. So you've got the humidity factor
Mhm.
naturally in your favor, but then it's going to be finding for those specific foods the being able to maintain the temperature with the humidity. So
Okay.
where humidity and temperature aren't as big of play, like it's basically room temperature. The longest storage, ideally, your temps would be in around the 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So I know depending
Oh.
on if you have air conditioning or what your internal house temperatures are, but that's going to
Okay.
be your garlic, your onions, and your winter squash. So
Okay.
the key with the garlic and the onions, though, if you're growing them yourself and or you're able to get them from a local farmer, is to cure them.
Mm.
And so you want and to pick long storage varieties of onions. Now, garlic soft neck actually usually will last 12 to 18 months. So it will go
Mm.
the longest before it will start to sprout. Hardneck will go anywhere from like 6 to 9 months. I've had a few hardneck go almost 12 months. My soft neck just naturally. So just kind of keep those things in mind when you're
Mhm.
planting and or purchasing them. Soft neck garlic is going to give you your longest storage.
Mm.
And then with your onions, you want to make sure that you have storage variety. So, like Walla Walla sweets, any sweet onion does not have long term storage viability. It will sprout and rot.
Mm.
You within a couple of months, sometimes 4 to 6 weeks, just depending on it. Your red onions, there are a couple of red onions that have a little bit longer storage variety, but most of your storage onions are going to be the yellow variety, specifically Patterson and Copra are both long-term storage onions. I have a variety that I got from Dixondale Onions. They're an online, you can order from them online and
Okay.
they'll ship out. And so I got it's called Blush, and it's a where they have bred together a long storage onion of the yellow variety with a red onion. So it's this really
Oh.
pretty, that's why it's blush. It's like this
Yeah.
beautiful pink blushy color,
Wow.
um, good flavor, and they have stored a whole year for me as well. So those also are
Okay.
really good storage. So you can just use a search engine and look up long-term, storage varieties and
Mhm.
then grow those yourself. And or like I said, if you're buying them from a local farmer, you want to make sure you're getting those long storage varieties. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. And so I don't
Right.
want you to set yourself up for failure there. So you want to cure them. And so ideally, that means that this you're leaving part of the stock and the stem on them. And
Mhm.
when you first harvest them, you leave all of the dirt on. So leave the dirt on, and then you're going to put them in an area where they can fully dry. You don't really want to put them in direct sunlight because you can get sun scald, but really good airflow where it's warm, and all of the dirt will dry, and
Mhm.
then the outer layers will also dry and get hard, and that's going to protect it and signal to the onion like, okay, it's time for me to go into dormancy. Don't
Mhm.
sprout and regrow again.
Mm.
So then you'll check your stem and you'll want to make sure that it's dry all the way through. So I leave mine kind of long, and so I can snip it and check every so often on them to see, is it internally dry? And then you can braid them if you have those long stems.
Mm.
And so that just makes you don't have to have as many different containers for storage. So I braid mine and then I just hang them in. I've hung them in closets. I've hung
Mm.
some in the kitchen for the ones that I'm doing. Ideally, the majority of them, aside from like the braid you're using, you do want to have them out of light. So if you can put them in a closet or a room or somewhere like that that doesn't have, big daylight coming through, or
Mhm.
next to the stove where it's hot, mine will last a whole year. So that's kind of the key on those. And at that point, after they're fully cured, then you can brush off the dirt. But if you
Mm.
try to brush off the dirt when it's still moist or have just been pulled before it's all the way dried and those outer layers are cured, you actually inadvertently end up pushing some of that dirt while it's still moist into the skin of the onion. And then it's a higher likelihood that it will begin to rot faster and it won't store as long.
Mm.
So that's kind of the thought process there. And
Okay.
then, so onions and garlic, I'd have to say, are going to be your two
Yeah.
easiest, provided you pick those, and they'll store
Mhm.
pretty much at room temp. Then after that, you have your winter squash. And one of the keys of the winter squash, and this is if you're harvesting it yourself or if you're buying it even at the store, is make sure the stem is still on. If
Mm.
the stem is off, then you are allowing oxygen can get through where the stem has been broken off, even though it feels like it's sealed, like it's not open. Oxygen gets through there and then they will break down and they won't store as long. So you really want to
Mm.
leave the stems on, just a few inches is fine. And then you're also going to cure them. So you want to see that stem when you first harvest them, right? It'll be green. And as it cures, that stem will turn brown and get really hard. So that's one of your indications, like, okay. And then it's also for that outer layer. You want that outer layer of skin to be hard and impenetrable. Like I'll check
Mm-hmm.
mine with my thumbnail, just kind of push on it and see if it goes through or if it's starting to harden up. And so you want them to dry and anywhere like 85 degrees Fahrenheit to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, out of direct sunlight is best, but where there's plenty of airflow and it's warm. So here where I live, that's actually hard to get sometimes in the month of October when you're harvesting a lot of that winter squash and it's ready. So I will even do mine by our fireplace if I don't have
Mm-hmm.
it, outdoor temperatures are no longer warm enough. So if you're like 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, they will cure within like maybe a week, 2 weeks max. If you're cooler, like 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, then it can take up to a month for them to cure. But once they're cured, then you just can move them. Like I said, I've done closets, I've done cupboards. I've even just done the open shelves beneath my kitchen island and put them in there. And spaghetti squash and delicata squash last the longest for me. I still have delicata squash we harvested in September and it's now May. Just on the other side of this wall, actually,
Wow.
we have a room that's just room temperature and they're storing there. So
Wow.
those
Yeah, I knew I was going to learn something. Okay, so I don't think I've ever officially got my squash ready for winter storage. I think I accidentally must have done that because they've lasted throughout the winter and stuff. But that was really, really great tips with both of those. And were you going to share something else?
I was going to say, the sugar pie pumpkins and acorn squash, those smaller ones, they will store for about 2 to 3 months on average. So those ones you definitely want to keep an
Okay.
eye on them and look for any little soft spots on the outside or feel them. Because once they start to go, once you notice it on one, usually the rest follow shortly thereafter. So that's always my sign. Like, okay, I've got to cook these up, figure out how I'm going to use them so I don't lose them all. But it does buy me time in the fall so that I'm not having to deal with them while I'm dealing with all the other things that won't just store on the shelf.
Right. Okay. Okay, that is really great information. And so you guys understand my listeners now understand why you're so valuable. You're such a valuable resource. Okay, that's the end of part 1. I'm excited for you to hear part 2, so be sure to check out episode 50. That is the next part in this series. Melissa's book link and other information will be in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. I hope you have a wonderful day.